Now it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, the amazing Faysal Mikdadi. Of you who already know Faysal, you will agree he is an incredible man. He's very, very modestly given this introduction for himself for me to read. Faysal was elected the academic director of the Hardy Society in November 2018. He's worked in education for over 50 years. He is a novelist and poet. His great love is reading 19th century novels and poetry by the Romantics, Augustans, Elizabethans, and in particular by Chaucer. As a teacher, he had and still has a passion for inculcating a love of and appreciation for literature. And we have copies of his excellent poetry anthologies for sale down on our merchandise table for those of you who would like to see the amazing amount of work that Faysal has been doing in schools with students promoting Hardy. We've got some of his books down there. So without further ado, may I please ask you to join me in welcoming Faysal.
Now, when the Trumpet Major was republished in the 1912 Macmillan edition, Hardy, in his general preface to it, which was written specifically for that, actually called it one of the Romances and Fantasies. It's almost as if he was telling us that this is a different novel to his norm. That kind of classification is not as eccentric as it sounds. It might be from Hardy's point of view by 1912, but from our point of view, we've seen a lot of that. For example, you will all know Greene used to divide his novels into serious works or entertainments. And his entertainments were things like The Third Man, The End of the Affair, and many other works, 6 of them in total. That kind of distinction actually tells us that it is probable that Hardy knew and felt this is a different novel to his norm. In fact, when it came out, the novel was received as something new, something different, reverting, according to the critics, to the old Hardy. For example, people were saying things like earlier Hardy novels, such as Before the Return of the Native, almost condemning it by implication. The reviewers felt that it contrasted with these old novels, that this is something new and fresh. And in many cases, yes, it is a fresh novel. That doesn't imply that his other novels weren't, but that's what the critics thought at the time. In fact, they used words like charm and quaintness, which I think is delightful, because to me, the word charm or charming is a death knell to any piece of work that one has written. In fact, only recently, I had a very polite, very pleasant email from a fairly prestigious editor who said that the work I had submitted on a literary subject was most charming indeed. I didn't need to carry on reading to know that equally politely he had declined to publish it. So therefore, in a funny kind of way, when you call a novel charming, full of charm and quaint, you know that the critic is trying to say, don't bother. The 1896 edition, which is a significant number of years before the very final one in 1912, Hardy made some significant changes to the original. Firstly, he actually inserted 2 minor references, but nonetheless they're quite powerful, about the death of John Loveday and several of his military colleagues. That gave it a kind of sobriety, a somber effect. They were shunted off, out of existence. More significantly, I feel, he actually changed the title. Originally, it was The Trumpet Major, A Tale. In this particular one, it became The Trumpet Major, John Loveday, a soldier in the war with Bonaparte, and Robert, his brother, first mate in the merchant service. A Tale. It's a bit of a mouthful as a title, but actually it tells us something, because it takes the giving a title to a novel back to the 18th century and before. as well as the early 9th century, that form of titling, not only of a novel, but also of chapters within a novel, which Hardy does here, was very, very common and very popular amongst people like Henry Fielding, Richardson, and many other, and Jonathan Swift, and Voltaire with his Candide. All of them use these very long titles that actually tell you what the content is. It's almost bizarre. Today's world, we don't do that by and large. And when people use titles like that, the editor or the publisher would ask them to shorten it significantly. There is an implication in all of this. The changes that Hardy has made to what he had previously written implies that he may have, I'm not saying he did, he may have felt that this novel was what is quaintly called a lesser novel, a less serious novel. To use Graham Greene's expression, an entertainment. Actually, I don't agree, and I will hope today in this talk to be able to show, and don't be put off by the extremely thick wad of paper I have in my hand. I shan't go on for hours. This is because the print is mahusive, mainly because I want to be able to deliver it, talk it, rather than read it. So occasionally I look at it to refer, that's all. So please don't panic. You can see the papers are moving away at great speed. I hope by the end of this talk I would have shown that this is actually a serious novel. Because in it, Hardy weaves fiction and history in a way that I think gives an entirely new and, at the time, original representation of reality. And I hope I can prove that. This is not a pleasant little novel that one reads for entertainment. Neither is it a purely historical novel. Many people refer to it as Hardy's only historical novel, a bit like Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities or Barnaby Rudge. These are not historical novels. They are novels with a serious intent. History happens to be the vehicle used. That's all. It is as serious as a novel, in my opinion. Don't hit me till I've finished in about 35, 40 minutes. It is as serious a novel as Jude the Obscure and as Tess of the d'Urberville, A Pure Woman, another titling that Hardy occasionally added to the titles of novels, almost as if he were saying to you, this is what the novel is going to be about. Now, he does it here, by the way, and he does it quite a lot, but I'll come back to that in a minute. I believe that the serious literature designation, which I don't particularly like anyhow, because literature is what I enjoy, not what others deem to be serious, and certainly not what academics tell me I should be reading. I read what I wish to read, and I enjoy it. And I'm not ashamed to say I enjoy so-called a lesser work, like the Trumpet Major, which is a firm favorite. I apologize for that. I was very nervous saying it, because the firm favorite over there is, of course, Far from the Madding Crowd. This is a firm favorite of mine. And this would allow me, if I may, to talk very briefly on a personal level. As far back as I can remember, from being the smallest child possible, I have been an extremely keen reader. I was a sickly child. I was a child with severely curtailed mobility and spent a huge amount of time either in hospital or in bed at home. And actually, I have very happy memories of spending almost all my time reading. And you could argue, of course, it was a form of escapism. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. It was my life at the time. In fact, my life ceased to be the hospital or the legs that wouldn't work. It was the characters in the novels. They populated the room, they populated my life. And in fact, I remember distinctly as a child, as I got tired and eyes got heavy, I shut the eyes not to go to sleep, but to bring forth all the characters. And I had love affairs in a childish way with many, many characters, both male and female. Don't read anything into this, please. It's politically incorrect. And furthermore, I brought in a lot of other characters who became my friends. And of course, most importantly, I was living a vicarious life, which I couldn't at the time, because not being allowed to move meant I couldn't do anything. Now, I had this overwhelming passion for literature, That so much so that after my health significantly improved, and I was allegedly normal, I love that word, whenever I'm told I'm normal, every time I have a blood test and the nurse says, "You'll be pleased to know you're normal," I ask for a letter so I can take it home to my wife and children to prove to them that I am now certifiably normal. Even after my health improved, I continued to read and do nothing but read. So much so that my poor father, in his adorably Victorian, slightly stodgy way, felt that I was living in a fantasy world, that I needed help to face up to the real world. So he offered me a Saturday job at the International Chemical Agencies, an agricultural company that he ran. And I had to go there every Saturday and work in the warehouse. It wasn't hard work because his secretary, who was very maternal and very kind to me, particularly after my mother died when I was 7, she colluded with me to find me a little corner where I could sit on bags of Gramoxone 50, a herbicide, God knows what it did to my lungs, herbicide on the side, and I could sit on them and read my novels. And I did. And I did that for many novels. In fact, after several novels, lo and behold, the director of the company, my dear father, came by with a client, saw me sitting on the bags reading, and promptly sacked me for dereliction of duty. You know, even today, I love going into garden centres and agricultural shops because the very smell of anything to do with agriculture, and some of it is quite repellent smell, actually brings back all those novels. I can't help it. It really is remarkable. You know, Proust had the Madeleine cake dipped in tea. I have Gramoxone, and I have a lot of other unsavory things that I smell and love. I don't quite put them on as an aftershave, but it brings all these memories back. I'm trying to illustrate how important literature becomes when it actually runs your life as a child. That's why I have a passion for encouraging literature amongst young persons. Why I have a passion for running poetry workshops. I actually believe these will be remembered for years and years and years and years to come. What I want to argue today is predicated on an important principle, which I hope you will either share with me, and if you don't share with me, you will allow me, just for today's talk, that we go to literature for the sheer love of it. Nothing else. I'm not going there to find a moral message, a moral tale, something that will teach me about this, that, or t'other. I go to it because I enjoy it. It's almost a physical sensation. A real enjoyment of sitting there with a book in a private world, in a controlled world, where nothing interferes with what I'm doing and spoils it. How else would we account for the fact that we keep going back to the same books over and over and over again all through our lifetime? In fact, I do that whenever life goes a little bit funny, whenever there's a challenge. When the lockdown came about, the first thing I did, as soon as our dear friend Johnson declared that there's going to be a lockdown for a minimum of 12 weeks, I went into what I quaintly call my library, it's the size of that table, and I took down my favorite novels. You know, and I piled them on the side. They were going to be the thing that will keep me going, and indeed they did. I usually go in poetry to Wordsworth, Pope, Donne, Tennyson, Shakespeare, and most of all Chaucer. I love reading Chaucer in the Middle English original. I do so often when I am in public. I don't mean standing in front and performing or busking. I mean sitting in a coffee shop. I'd happily whisper read it to myself. And sometimes I see people looking at me, and I get the impression they might be thinking, oh, bless him, he's just arrived in Britain. He hasn't quite got the hang of the language. I also I literally go to Dickens, George Eliot, the Brontes, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Hardy. And it's important to... these ones I go to, by the way, not to read from cover to cover sometimes. I might feel a bit depressed or upset or unhappy, and the hand goes up and pulls down David Copperfield and reads chapter 1, I Am Born. or retrospect, chapter 7, so on. But by now I almost know it by heart. The grandchildren love to say, Grandad, recite David Copperfield, because it's such a huge book. Grandad must be a genius to be able to recite it. They haven't quite twigged that I know 2 sentences from here, there, and everywhere, which I keep reciting. They love being able to open it and ask a question from it. You know, what was the name of the boat in which the child Copperfield went with his stepfather, Murdstone? Skylark. Who was on it? Quinion and Parsonage. And it just goes on like that. Who could remember such gibberish? Well, I do, and I remember it also with Hardy novels. Everything becomes all right, and I will keep reading them, and every time I read them, of course they evoke childhood. Warmth, security, happiness, and of course, most importantly, a contained little word. I keep going back to the contained little word. This is important because I believe that's what the Trumpet Major does as a novel. It's a very contained little word. And of course, you and I have experienced that since March 23rd. Our world suddenly became incredibly contained, incredibly small. And I suddenly found myself in lockdown feeling very happy. And jokingly saying, I'm particularly happy because I don't see my 11 grandchildren. I'm particularly happy because there are no visitors. But actually what I'm happy with is the fact that my world has suddenly got very small. I have no responsibility except the room I'm sitting in and the small garden in the back. And therefore I needn't worry suddenly. It doesn't matter. I needn't go to meetings. And no offense meant about meetings. I needn't interact with others because there's no one around. But of course, this doesn't quite work because Zoom spoils it. There are 5 reasons why I believe this novel to be serious, and I'm going to try and go through them and analyze them. You will keep an eye on time and shout at me when I am running out of it. The first one is the fact that there is amazing historical accuracy in this novel. The second one is there's a tremendous wealth of detail that is often missed by readers. A lot of readers see this novel as full of characters who are stereotyped. I don't like that word particularly because if we're going to say that, that kicks Dickens out of literature completely, out of the great canon of Western literature, because almost all his characters are stereotypes. But that doesn't happen, that doesn't matter, and I will show that in a minute. Thirdly, there is a diversity of characters. There are lots and lots of different people. Yes, they are a bit one-dimensional, but they're all different, each one. Fourthly, there's clear Victorian melodrama that keeps repeating itself in the novel, a theatrical approach. And finally, it has a wonderfully light-hearted way of expressing itself. The language is quite wonderful. That's the only thing I haven't analyzed fully with this. But reading it at times is almost like reading a good poem. Yes, it is different to what used to be the somber Hardy novel. It's different to what later became the typical pessimistic Hardy worldview, the fatalist worldview, which, by the way, I don't believe is fatalist. In the case of the mayor of Casterbridge, it's not fate that brings Hansard down. It's Hansard that brings Hansard down. There's a character flaw, and that is wonderfully Shakespearean. When Shakespeare does it, it's great. When Hardy does it, it's fate. It isn't. Like real life, almost everything that happens to me is due to something I did. That's why suddenly the lockdown made life a lot easier, because I wasn't doing anything. The wealth of detail starts off almost from the very beginning. When the novel opens, we have, in the days of high-waisted and muslin-gowned women, in the day of high-waisted and muslin-gowned women, we immediately know that this novel is set in a different time. Immediately, it's almost like a little headline. It goes on to describe the way that Anne Garland appears. She wore a white handkerchief to cover her white neck and a cap on her head with a pink ribbon round it, tied in a bow at the front. That's quite detailed. And why is it that Hardy feels he has to do that? Well, he does it over and over and over again. He describes the way people look. When we first see, and please correct me, it only occurred to me this morning, so if I've got it wrong, I ask you to forgive me. But the first time we see Gabriel Oak looking at Bathsheba at a distance, she is in red. Is that correct? And that's all we see, the redness. He doesn't give us a full description of everything else. Here he describes her in fair detail, and yet it's the minutiae, the ribbon, the pink ribbon, and all of that. The eye for detail gives the feel within the book of what I'm calling incontrovertible veracity. It's real. It's in front of you. And I'm going to give you an example of how one could prove that. I could prove it, and you're going to laugh at me now, I know. I could prove it because in using intricate detail, Hardy mentions colours in the novel 260 times. He mentions items of clothing 254 times. He mentions items of food 125 times. He also uses openings over and over again, windows, doors, gates, chinks. In fact, a total of 305 times. By now you're thinking, is he serious? He sat there counting them. Well, what do you do during a lockdown but count the number of times something is mentioned in a Hardy novel? You wait till I give you the next example, because I wanted to see if this applies elsewhere to novels which build themselves from minutiae, from small things. The way, for example, Maupassant in his short stories, particular short stories, for example, The Necklace, uses colours. Because they're short stories, they're easier to sit and count the number of times a colour comes up. And you realize that's why the story somehow feels colourful. In David Copperfield, a very, very firm favourite novel of mine, Dickens uses objects, that's chairs, tables, and so on, 2,500 times. He uses animals 230 times. He uses drinks, food, and other such similar items 600 times, clothing 442 times, and vehicles 131 times, making up 33 different kinds of vehicles. Again, you're asking, did he sit down and count them? Yes, I did. Therefore, they would be probably inaccurate. Anyone in here sad enough to go and count these things in the Trumpet Major or Copperfield to prove me wrong, I'd be very grateful. Please send me the right figure. But I hope it makes the point, which is that these minutiae, these little details, add up to create an atmosphere, to drive the narrative forward, to create what we walk away with the Trumpet Major. What do we remember when we put it aside? When we say a Trumpet Major, last week I met a friend who said, I'm ever so sorry I can't make today's talk and today's study day. I'm a little nervous going out. However, the Trumpet Major was my O-level textbook 500 years ago. Do you remember the O-levels? And it's always been a firm favourite. Again, it could be to do with youth, but the probability is you walk away from this and you have a feeling of sunshine. That's the only word I can think of. It's a novel that has a huge amount of sunshine, even when it's raining. Now, Michael Irwin, quite rightly, our vice president, as well as, in my opinion, one of the most respected professors I've ever known, and I don't particularly respect professors, but he has actually talked about the fact that the use of these props, these things, appear odd to us in the modern world. And of course they do, because to the modern reader, walking sticks, canes are in very short supply. A wide range of Victorian gestures involved accoutrements that have now disappeared or become very scarce. Hats, gloves, fans, monocles, parasols, snuff boxes, pocket watches, beards, and so on and so forth. Mike Irwin was writing a little bit a few years ago when he wrote this. In today's world, I can see a novel in 100 years having accoutrements such as mobile, ear things. I haven't done any of them. The Apple Watch, laptop, iPad, car keys that click at a great distance and open the boot. So, it's not that different. But it creates something. I think that through this, Hardy builds an ethos, an atmosphere that is very, very strong. And in order to give it further veracity, he is very accurate with his historical references. In order to do that, Hardy worked extremely hard to research the history of the time of this novel. This work, which I promise you, if you wish to look at it, and I've put the two pieces of paper of the bits I'm referring to, has 80 pages of the Trumpet Major notebook. Please feel free to look at it during the break, if you wish. This is very important because that kind of planning, that kind of research tells you that Hardy was working very hard to say, look, this is real. As if you and I would know anyhow. And what's more, why is he so bothered about the veracity of the story, of the historical veracity? Well, he says this in his preface for the 1895 volume. The present tale is founded more largely on testimony, oral and written, than any other in this theories. The external incidents which direct its course are mostly an unexaggerated reproduction of the recollections of all persons well known to the author in childhood and now long dead. He adds, as if it's an afterthought, other proofs of veracity of this chronicle have escaped my recollection. It's almost as if he's saying, look, if you find a mistake, forgive me, I forgot. Why is he so keen on telling us this is real? It's not the historical fact he's talking about, although, of course, it is directly. It's the fact that he is keen on telling you this is a true story. This really happened. He brings it to life. And he does it through this incredible historical detail. There are two examples I could give you. One is written in the handwriting, we believe, of Emma Hardy, about the section in there, which I put a piece of paper for you to refer to if you want, on the trumpeters. And the description of what trumpeters should be, how they should behave, how they should look, actually gives a very clear and accurate kind of background description of John Loveday. Polite, pleasant, considerate, quiet, unobtrusive, and attractive. It really does. And it's amazing that these two, read them side by side, and you can quite clearly see it. There are others. One of them is the one with the king and the queen arriving in Budmouth, and all the things that happen while they're reviewing the troops and so on. Again, it's almost not quite taken out word by word. A little bit as Dickens does in David Copperfield, where he uses his autobiographical fragment and replicates it almost word for word in the sections of David Copperfield working at Murdstone and Grimby, the blacking factory. That Dickens worked in the blacking factory. This is in the wine bottle factory. But he uses it word for word, except he replaces the word small with the word little. Little is an emotive word. You know, when Tracy is a bit unkind to me, I say, please don't be nasty, I'm so little. I wouldn't say, please don't be so nasty, I'm so small, because that implies purely physically small, whereas little has a connotation. Little is used in David Copperfield over 2,000 times, not pounds, I've got money on the brain, 2,000 times, whereas small is used a handful of times. We have the novel consistently repeating one thing I spoke about earlier, which is seeing things through windows, doors, any opening, a gate. We have the novel at the beginning have Anne standing at the casement, looking out and wondering what's going on. And if you remember, Simon explains to her what's going on. He's an old soldier and he keeps forgetting. It's almost as if Hardy himself is smiling as an omniscient author from a distance at the fact that these things happened in the past and we do forget them. That happens quite a lot in the novel, and I'll come back to it later if I may. He also brings all kinds of famous people in, and he brings them to life in a way that, as you know, Tolstoy does in War and Peace and Victor Hugo does in Les Miserables. When, for example, we have a soldier, if you remember Stannard, singing that sarcastic or ironic song about Bonaparte coming to London town, Immediately Hardy intervenes and says, tells you that he was mortally wounded, trampled down by a French hussar when the brigade was deploying into line under Beresford. He tells you he's going to die. He gives you a historical figure, a historical statement. We have another one where Anne is watching the Victory from a distance. Do you remember that one? As the Victory is passing on its way to the famous Trafalgar. And she starts crying when she's finished talking to an old sailor. And two men are standing beside her, and one of them comes up and talks to her and asks her what the matter is. And of course, she immediately recognizes the king. It's interesting because this king that she recognizes comes across almost as a chap passing the time of day, chatting to a passerby. How are you? How are you doing? Why are you crying? What's the problem? What's his name? And she gives him the name. And it really is quite powerful because when, by the way, Tolstoy does it, he has Prince Andrei on the floor after the Battle of Borodino. He's been injured. And as he's looking up at the sky, he sees the sudden appearance of a huge charger. The perspective is quite powerful, with Napoleon sitting on it, looking down at him. And every time we have somebody appear, whether it's Kutuzov, Napoleon, Bagration, or anyone, or Tsar Alexander, Tolstoy makes it absolutely clear, these are great people. Hardy doesn't do that. Doesn't do it at all. In this particular case, he also makes fun of himself. Because as Anne walks home, she indulges in a slight fantasy about the king remembering Robert's name and issuing a command to make him an admiral so he never has to travel again. And Hardy says this, almost as if he's smiling from a distance, a bit like Jane Austen does or George Eliot does in Middlemarch, where they stand back and the ironic smile about human frailty is there. He says, but she was not a girl who indulged in extravagant fancies, says the author who's writing a fantasy and a fancy. She does not indulge in fancies long, and before she reached home, she thought that the king had probably forgotten her by that time, and her troubles, and her lover's name. That is a wonderful, wonderful reminder by Hardy that this is, after all, a tale that mimics itself. I've said before about Tolstoy using historical figure. I'll do the same with Hugo when he talks about the Battle of Waterloo, with Thénardier looking around, robbing dead soldiers, and eventually appearing to... He was robbing Montmorency, but in fact the man hadn't died, and later on assumed he'd saved his life, which he hadn't. He was robbing him. That kind of touch, that detail is... But there is one thing Hardy does better than both Tolstoy and Hugo. If anybody loves those two very much, you're going to be annoyed with me. But actually Hardy does it better because he makes the people who are famous, who are great, utterly normal. Boringly normal. There's the king to start with, and then there is, of course, more importantly, there is Hardy, Captain Hardy. When Robert goes to see him, Hardy is a neighbor chatting to another neighbor. You don't get the impression you're in the presence of some great person. Certainly not the hero of Trafalgar along with Nelson. And that's done brilliantly because, again, he humanizes those characters. And by doing that, he gives veracity to the fictional characters. That's Hardy, the great hero of Trafalgar. I'm a fictional character. You put us together, we're chatting away like good old mates, and at the end of it, Hardy over there recommends me for some kind of promotion because of my heroism. It really does work. He normalizes what I'm calling here normalizing humanity, regardless of who the character is. It works very, very well. And again, he, yet again, intervenes. Hardy intervenes quite a lot in this novel. He is the omniscient author, but he comes forward occasionally and nudges you as a reader. In this case, he says, Anne now felt herself close and looking into the stream of recorded history, within whose banks the littlest things are great, and outside which she and the general bulk of the human race were content to live on, unreckoned and unheeded superfluity. Beautiful description of the little person. But at the same time, this is Hardy saying, that's the way it is. She was there, she is there, like the king. He also introduces my third one. I'm speeding up because I'm nervous about time. I apologize. The diversity of character. We do have a huge number of characters, and yet the world is very self-contained. It's Miller Lovedays' house, and Anne and Mrs. Garland's part of it, the annex to it. That's the world of the novel. We occasionally go out to Little Budmouth, we occasionally go out down here, there and everywhere, but the real going out into the world is reported back to us. Trafalgar, Finisterre, all of them are reported back to us. And these people, the small number, all push out into a much, much bigger number. All the soldiers around, all the pretty girls tripping, as Hardy puts it, up and down the esplanade in Budmouth, all of those people, and of course the biggest number, soldiers. A huge number of soldiers. And the novel opens with almost a theatrical, pantomimic view of all those people coming in to fetch each other from the Garlands' home. First, Loveday comes in, he's followed by John Loveday, who's followed by 2 soldiers, who then followed themselves by 3, who are themselves followed by 2, and they're all in a minute passage, and the only way out for John with Anne on his arm is for them to stand up, squeeze perpendicularly against the wall. It's almost a pantomime, and it's done deliberately to give us a very clear idea of the diversity of characters. I'm going to skip some bits with your permission. We have Anne, who is seemingly petulant, wavering, easily waylaid in conversation, and at times actually quite rude, quite abrupt. And we have Robert, who is unbelievable. How any woman could ever fall in love with a man like that is beyond me. His behavior is abominable. Kissing Anne's hand and then saying, but I don't love you, it's nothing to do with Matilda, I love Matilda, I only did it because, and listen to his language, I saw you, I admired you as a sweet little craft. I think by now I would have administered a very severe slap across the face. He describes his wife, Matilda, as an excellent body, a real charmer, a nice, comely young woman, a miracle of genteel breeding. She can throw her hair into the nicest curls, and she's got splendid gowns and head clothes, a land mermaid. Another slap on the other side of the face, because presumably she has no brain, she has no character, she has no personality. It really is quite repulsive, and he does it over and over and over again. And this is all done, the diversity of character, the detail of the appearances, and the historical veracity are all interspersed with amazing Victorian melodrama. In fact, again, back to Mike Irwin, he talks about the novel, all Victorian novels almost, reflecting the popularity of melodrama in the 19th century. And they did. So does this one. Very, very strong. And he talks about melodrama being the extremities of life, juxtaposed against the normalcy of life. Pure and simple. And actually Hardy does this superbly. When old Benjamin Derriman, asks Anne to come and see him, it's a very melodramatic section because it takes a lot of work to convince her to go. When she does go, he walks her with a candle down the stairs into a dark cellar to show her where he keeps his tin box. If that isn't out of melodrama, I don't know what is. And it really is done quite superbly, and it happens over and over again. There is theatre and there is melodrama. And of course, at one point, if you remember, we are sitting in a theatre with the king and with Matilda Johnson as one of the actresses on the stage, and with John standing to the sides, pretending he's in love with one of the actresses in order to allow Robert and Anne to get together. This is all the kind of French farce type attitude. And it happens quite a lot. This is where I bring in the theatricality of seeing things through chinks. I'm going to skip a lot of pages now where I've given almost every example of those, where people see through doors, through windows. Please take my word for it as I skip a huge number of pages, because I'm getting vibes from a person on my right whose name will remain anonymous to finish off. But there are a huge number of them, as I said earlier, over 300. Irwin, as I said, describes the characters as stereotypes. I agree, they're stereotypes in the sense that they lack depth. But I believe that to be deliberate by Hardy. This is theatre. And theatre, by and large, lacks depth in appearance, but not in dialogue. And that happens within this novel, in my opinion. When our friend Robert talks about how he thought that his brother John was looking after Anne, keeping an eye on her, he swears to change and never ever to look at another woman while this one is free. But he actually qualifies it by saying, look at another woman for purposes of marriage. I mean, the man is an absolute cad, because at the end of the day, presumably once he's married, because she's no longer free, he can actually start looking at other women for things that are infinitely more interesting than marriage, because marriage is the only one that's going to get in his way. He explains a lot. He even explains why he was unfaithful by talking about, well, when a man loves a woman in a port, at home, and then he goes and explains that nothing changes really. Deep down, he still loves her. The 5 things I spoke of, that's the detailed physical description, the accurate historical details, diversity of characters, theatrical prop, and the light-hearted way of recounting the novel, works beautifully. And the pantomimic bit is, of course, mostly in Festus. Festus, who uses expressions, oh, my heart and my limbs, my wig, dash my wig. And his grandfather, Derriman, says things like, scrunch it all. I mean, who talks like that? Well, the evil person standing on the pantomime at Christmas, they throw out these comments. When we're in the theatre even, Hardy reminds us over and over again, this is but a tale, like the theatre in front of you. So when the story about Calder winning a battle at Finisterre, a great triumph, in fact it wasn't. He was court-martialed and reprimanded for dereliction of duty. And Hardy's doing this deliberately. He'd done his research. He knew that hadn't happened. So he's actually saying this seems as if, but it isn't. Rather like my novel. I can now skip a lot of those because they're examples of humor, because I think humor is important in this novel. And the humor is to do mainly with characters. He talks about soldiers who hadn't had a chance with the pretty girls because others had picked them up. But he says it didn't matter because they would look elsewhere. Because a half an inch of nose more or less is not important. They're not bothered about the trifling deficiency of teeth or a larger crop of freckles than is customary in the Anglo-Saxon race. Most politically incorrect. But he's actually saying that men couldn't care less. As long as it's breathing and vaguely alive and warm, they're all right to run after it. He also is very insulting in a funny way towards the German soldiers, whom he calls Lieutenant Nockehielman, Cornet Fitzenhardt, and Captain Klaspin-Kissen. In today's world, somebody would take him to court over this. When Robert decides to marry Matilda after only 2 weeks of knowing her, his father says, wasn't that a bit short? And Robert's response is, well, actually, it wasn't. It was more. It was 15 days and a quarter. And when he loses her, he suffers severely, and I gave the whole passage here. He eats huge amounts of food, but no gravy. That must be awful. And he goes to Budmouth and watches the pretty girls tripping on the walk. He is in every way a philanderer, and yet she falls in love with him. And she falls in love with him, and Hardy justifies it beautifully by talking about love is foolish. These things happen, and a woman will not let reason get in the way of falling in love with a cad. He doesn't use the word cad, it's mine. He also mentions Paul and Virginie. That's Paul et Virginia. Paul et Virginie is a novel by Bernardine de Saint-Pierre, and it's a very romantic novel written at the end of the 18th century. Hardy loved it when he was 9. He was given it as a gift in English, and he liked it. And he was influenced by it, and it's reproduced here. I'm almost finished. He talks about Anne descended to the open air, shook the flower from her like a bird, and went out into the garden amid the September sunshine, whose rays lay level across the blue haze which the earth gave forth. The gnats were dancing up and down in airy companies. The nasturtium flowers shone out in groups from the dark hedge over which they climbed, and the mellow smell of the decline of summer was exhaled by everything. I can almost hear Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, pastoral in the background. It's a beautiful passage, and it's a passage that reflects love, in a way that Paul et Virginie does. Nature and love stand side by side. Another one who does it is Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his Confession, as well as his Émile. Beautifully done. There's another novel which Hardy would have not written. It's the last page, I promise. And he wouldn't have it, but it brought it to mind, and that is a novel by Napoleon Bonaparte called Clisson et Eugénie, and it's a story which he based on his own love for Eugénie Désirée Claret. Napoleon makes a big mistake. He's not a Hardy, I assure you. No wonder he lost every battle at the end, because he mistakes romance and assumes passion is romance. And that's what the novel is about. Hardy doesn't do that. He stays with romance beautifully. But then Beethoven would, wouldn't he? Because when he was going home, he wrote to Josephine, "Ne te lave pas, j'accours, et dans 8 jours je suis là," which I translated into, "Do not wash, I hasten, and in 8 days I shall be with you." He's disgusting, isn't he? And in today's world with COVID, washing your hands for 20 seconds wouldn't work at all with him. These characters actually work, and towards the end, Mike Irwin talks about the novel beginning to lose its way. Yes, it does a little bit, but it loses its way in a way a farce does. You know, mistaken identity, mixtures, and so on and so forth. It works, and it works superbly. I want to finish with a very quick quotation, please, from Warren and Wellick about how the accretion of novels work. The meaning of a work of art cannot be defined merely in terms of its meaning for the author and his contemporaries. They're gone. It is rather the result of a process of accretion, the history of its criticism by many readers in many ages. That's why we keep rereading novels. I hope that for this age at least, I have shown that the Trumpet Major is enjoyable, is funny, is clever, and most importantly, is a novel worth being taken seriously as literature. Thank you. I apologize, I went on for an extra 5 minutes, for which I will never be forgiven.
Thank you very much, Faysal.
Can I just say one thing? We haven't got any formal thank yous for lecturers here, but I just want to say that is one of the best lectures on a Hardy novel I've ever heard. That I think that Faysal belongs in the same grouping as Mike Irwin, who he mentioned, and Christopher Ricks, as people who talk a lot of sense without a lot of academic nonsense. And I think that's a tremendous lecture, and thank you very much.